April 22, 1945. The Führerbunker, 15 meters beneath the shattered garden of the Reich Chancellery. The air is thick with dampness and the acrid smell of mildew clinging to concrete walls that tremble with each Soviet shell impact above. In the narrow conference room lit by bare bulbs that flicker with every distant explosion, Adolf Hitler stands hunched over a map table, his left hand trembling uncontrollably, his eyes bloodshot and sunken into a face that has aged 20 years in the span of months. Around him stand men in immaculate uniforms adorned with medals earned in campaigns across Europe, Africa, and the Eastern Front, generals who once commanded armies numbering in the millions, now reduced to defending a city being devoured block by block. The Führer's voice, once capable of igniting stadiums of fervent believers, now cracks with desperation as he issues an order that defies every principle of military logic: Berlin must be held at all costs. Not a single street may be surrendered. Every building will become a fortress. Every man, woman, and child will fight to the last breath. This is not strategy. This is the death rattle of ideology colliding with reality. But before you witness the final collapse of the Third Reich's capital, you need to understand how the most powerful military machine ever assembled in Europe arrived at this moment of absolute delusion. How did the armies that conquered France in 6 weeks, that pushed to the gates of Moscow, that controlled territory from the Atlantic to the Volga, find themselves trapped in a concrete tomb beneath a dying city? The answer lies not just in military defeats, but in the fundamental disconnect between Hitler's vision of reality and the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. And in those final days of April 1945, that disconnect would transform Berlin into a graveyard where ideology died harder than the men defending it. The path to the Führerbunker began not in April but in January, when the Soviet winter offensive tore through German defensive lines in Poland like a scythe through dead wheat. The Vistula-Oder offensive, launched on January 12, saw 2.2 million Soviet soldiers supported by 6,000 tanks and 46,000 artillery pieces smash through Army Group A's positions in a matter of days. German units that had been bled white on the Eastern Front for 3.5 years simply disintegrated. By the end of January, Soviet forces stood on the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. For the first time since Frederick the Great, enemy armies approached the Prussian capital not from the west but from the east, carrying with them the accumulated rage of a people who had lost 27 million of their own. Hitler's response was not to negotiate, not to consolidate defenses, not to evacuate the civilian population. Instead, he demanded that every inch of German soil be defended with fanatical resistance. He dismissed generals who suggested strategic withdrawals. He transferred SS units from the Western Front to the east, weakening defenses against the advancing Americans and British. He promoted younger, more ideologically committed officers to replace the experienced commanders who dared speak of military realities. The Führer lived increasingly in a world constructed from fantasy divisions that existed only on paper, phantom armies that his staff dared not tell him had been destroyed weeks earlier, and miracle weapons that would never arrive in sufficient numbers to alter the tide of war. By early April, the strategic situation had become catastrophic. In the west, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were racing across central Germany, encountering minimal resistance. In the south, the Wehrmacht was collapsing in Austria and Yugoslavia. In the north, German forces were cut off in the Baltic states and East Prussia. And from the east, two massive Soviet fronts, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front, assembled for the final assault on Berlin with a combined force of 2.5 million men, 6,000 tanks, and over 40,000 artillery pieces. The city they prepared to assault held fewer than 90,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, 45,000 Volkssturm militia composed of boys as young as 12 and men as old as 60, and scattered remnants of shattered units that had retreated into the capital. Against this, Hitler placed his faith in willpower, in racial superiority, in the mystical belief that history would not permit the destruction of the thousand-year Reich. The generals who stood in that bunker on April 22 knew better. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, had witnessed the steady deterioration of German military power for 2 years. General Hans Krebs, the new army chief of staff, had served on the Eastern Front and understood exactly what was coming. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the LVI Panzer Corps and soon to be named commander of Berlin's defense, had just fought a desperate retreat from the Seelow Heights where his units had been shattered by the most concentrated artillery barrage in human history, nearly 9,000 Soviet guns firing simultaneously in a bombardment that consumed more ammunition in 30 minutes than the entire Wehrmacht possessed. These were professional soldiers who understood that Berlin could not be held, that further resistance meant only the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of civilians, that the war was already lost. Yet when Hitler spoke, they listened. When he commanded, they obeyed. Not because they believed in victory, but because the architecture of Nazi Germany had been constructed to make disobedience unthinkable. Officers who suggested retreat were relieved of command and sometimes executed. Generals who failed to achieve impossible objectives were dismissed in disgrace. The SS maintained surveillance networks within the military itself, and any hint of defeatism could result in arrest, torture, and death. By April 1945, the Wehrmacht had executed approximately 15,000 of its own soldiers for desertion or defeatism, more than in all of World War I. In Berlin, SS execution squads roamed the streets, hanging soldiers and civilians from lampposts for displaying white flags or refusing to fight. The nooses bore signs reading, "I am a coward," or "I betrayed the Führer." So when Hitler demanded that Berlin be defended to the last, his generals clicked their heels and said it would be done. When he insisted that relief forces would break through from the north and south to rescue the capital, they did not tell him those forces consisted of broken divisions with no fuel, no ammunition, and no hope. When he moved phantom armies across the map table in the bunker, planning counterattacks that would never occur, they maintained a fiction rather than face his rage. The German military, which had prided itself on professional competence and strategic clarity since the days of von Moltke, had become a theater troupe performing fantasies for an audience of one. The young German soldiers manning hastily constructed barricades in Berlin streets had expected something different. They had been raised on newsreels showing the Wehrmacht's triumphs, the lightning conquest of Poland, the fall of France, the seemingly unstoppable advance into the Soviet Union. They had been told they were members of a master race destined to rule Europe for 1,000 years. They had believed in the invincibility of German arms, in the genius of their Führer, in the righteousness of their cause. Now they crouched behind overturned tramcars and piles of rubble as Soviet Katyusha rockets shrieked overhead and IS-2 heavy tanks ground through the streets, their 122mm guns reducing entire buildings to dust with single shots. What these young soldiers experienced in those final weeks bore no resemblance to the glorious war they had imagined. The Soviet forces that crashed into Berlin's outskirts on April 21 brought with them a fury shaped by 4 years of total war. They had marched 2,000 kilometers from Stalingrad, liberating destroyed cities and encountering evidence of systematic atrocities, the extermination camps, the burned villages, the mass graves. The letters these Soviet soldiers wrote home in the final weeks of the war reveal an army motivated not by Marxist ideology but by raw vengeance. "We have learned to hate as we never hated before," wrote one Red Army sergeant. "Berlin will pay for Stalingrad, for Leningrad, for every Russian village they burned. We will show them what war really means." The fighting that consumed Berlin in the last 2 weeks of April 1945 ranks among the most savage urban combat in history. Unlike the grinding attritional warfare of the Western Front in World War I, or even the brutal house-to-house fighting at Stalingrad, the Battle of Berlin unfolded with mechanized intensity. Soviet commanders had studied Stalingrad's lessons carefully. They divided Berlin into sectors, assigned specific objectives to assault groups combining infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineers, and advanced systematically, reducing strongpoints with overwhelming firepower rather than costly assaults. German defensive positions rarely lasted more than hours before being flanked or obliterated. The Volkssturm militia, equipped with obsolete rifles, limited ammunition, and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, occupied the lowest circle of this hell. These men, shopkeepers, clerks, factory workers, had received perhaps 10 hours of military training before being issued uniforms and sent to defend neighborhoods where many of them lived. They watched Soviet tanks crush through barricades it had taken them days to construct. They witnessed German soldiers, some barely 14 years old, incinerated by flamethrowers while defending subway stations. They saw buildings collapse on trapped civilians as artillery reduced entire blocks to moonscapes. And they understood, with absolute clarity, that their sacrifice would achieve nothing except prolonging their own deaths. Yet many continued fighting. Some from fear of SS execution squads. Some from desperate hope that the promised relief forces would arrive. Some from sheer inability to conceive of alternatives. The Nazi state had been so totalizing, had so completely structured German society around obedience and collective purpose, that even in obvious defeat, the mechanisms of compliance continued functioning. Officers issued orders. Soldiers obeyed. Civilians followed instructions. The machinery of the state ground onward even as the state itself died. In the Führerbunker, Hitler's daily military briefings became exercises in collective delusion. On April 22, the day Soviet forces completed the encirclement of Berlin, Hitler demanded a counterattack by SS General Felix Steiner's army group to break the Soviet ring from the north. Steiner's army group consisted of approximately 10,000 men with no tanks, minimal artillery, and fuel sufficient for perhaps 20 kilometers of movement. The attack never materialized because it was impossible. When informed of this reality, Hitler erupted into what witnesses described as his most catastrophic breakdown of the war. He screamed that the Wehrmacht had betrayed him, that the German people had proven themselves unworthy, that all was lost. For several hours, he spoke of suicide. But by evening, the spell had passed. Hitler recovered his composure and resumed planning Berlin's defense as if nothing had changed. He divided the city into defensive sectors. He issued orders for non-existent reinforcements to relieve the capital. He composed lengthy directives about maintaining morale and fighting to the last cartridge. The generals around him maintained the performance, discussing tactical details of a battle they knew was already lost, because the alternative was to confront a reality too terrible to acknowledge, that they had followed this man into absolute catastrophe, that their obedience had destroyed their nation, that the ideology they had served was leading them not to glory but to annihilation. The symbolic object that haunted those final days was not a weapon or a banner but something far more mundane, a can of food. As Berlin's infrastructure collapsed under bombardment, as water mains ruptured and electrical grids failed, as the civilian population huddled in cellars and subway tunnels, food became the currency of survival. German soldiers and civilians alike survived on ever-shrinking rations, bread that was more sawdust than grain, horse meat from animals killed by shellfire, whatever could be scavenged from shattered shops. Meanwhile, in the Führerbunker, Hitler's staff continued serving meals on fine china with silver utensils, maintained wine cellars stocked with French vintages, and prepared elaborate dinners as Soviet shells exploded overhead. The contrast could not have been starker. Above ground, Berlin's population was starving. Below ground, the Nazi leadership dined. And further east, Soviet soldiers discovered warehouses filled with food the Wehrmacht had hoarded, supplies that could have fed Berlin civilians for months but were reserved for military use. When these warehouses fell to Soviet forces, Red Army soldiers found stockpiles of canned goods, preserved meats, and delicacies looted from across occupied Europe. They also found wine cellars holding bottles marked with tags indicating they had been seized from France, Italy, and Hungary. The plenty that Nazi Germany had extracted from conquered peoples now fed the armies that came to destroy it. For the Soviet soldiers who fought through Berlin streets, these discoveries confirmed everything they had been told about fascism, that it served only elites, that it took from the many to enrich the few, that its promises of national greatness were hollow shells concealing systematic exploitation. They saw German civilians emerging from cellars, skeletal from hunger, while Nazi officials lived in comfort beneath the chancellery. They found abandoned SS facilities where guards had fled, leaving behind evidence of privilege and excess while the city above them burned. The ideology that had promised to unite the German Volk had instead created a hierarchy where the true believers feasted while the believers starved. By April 28, Soviet forces had advanced to within 500 meters of the Führerbunker. The thunder of artillery was now a continuous roar that made the bunker's walls shake without pause. Hitler's daily briefings had become surreal performances attended by an ever-shrinking circle of true believers. Generals who could escape to surrender to the Western Allies did so. Those who remained did so either from misplaced loyalty or from knowledge that Soviet captivity would be brief and terminal. On April 29, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a small ceremony in the bunker. The wedding feast consisted of champagne and sandwiches. Outside, Berlin was dying by the hour. The relief forces that Hitler still insisted would save the capital had either been destroyed or surrendered. To the north, what remained of Steiner's forces had dissolved. To the south, the 12th Army under General Walther Wenck had fought desperately not to reach Berlin but to hold open escape routes for German forces and civilians fleeing Soviet encirclement. General Weidling, commanding Berlin's defense, drafted surrender documents. He knew that every hour of continued resistance cost thousands of lives to no purpose. But he dared not present them to Hitler, whose fantasy of impending victory had hardened into absolute conviction. The end came on April 30th. That afternoon, as Soviet forces fought through the Tiergarten barely 300 meters away, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to their private quarters in the Führerbunker. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, staff members heard a single gunshot. When they entered minutes later, they found Hitler dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound and Braun dead from cyanide poisoning. The man who had demanded that Berlin be defended to the last had chosen to exit before the final curtain, leaving his remaining followers to face the consequences of his delusions. The generals who had obeyed Hitler's impossible orders now acted with sudden clarity. Within hours of his death, they initiated surrender negotiations with Soviet forces. On May 2, General Weidling ordered all Berlin defenders to cease resistance. Throughout the shattered city, German soldiers emerged from bunkers and cellars, hands raised, white flags displayed. The Battle of Berlin was over. It had cost approximately 100,000 German soldiers and civilians killed, and perhaps 80,000 Soviet soldiers dead. The city itself had been reduced to ruins, 70% of its buildings damaged or destroyed, its population reduced from 4.3 million to 2.8 million through evacuation, flight, and death. What Hitler had demanded was absolute defense. What his generals delivered was absolute destruction. The ideology that had promised to elevate Germany to unprecedented greatness had instead reduced it to rubble and divided it between occupying powers for the next 4 decades. The military that had prided itself on professional excellence had been corrupted into an instrument of genocide and had ultimately destroyed itself through unquestioning obedience to insane commands. The soldiers who had believed in their racial superiority had learned through immolation that ideology cannot stop artillery shells, that willpower cannot replace logistics, that faith in a leader is worthless when that leader has lost all connection to reality. In the years that followed, survivors of Berlin's fall struggled to articulate what they had experienced. Some German veterans would claim they fought for their homeland, not for Hitler. Some would insist they were simply following orders, trapped by duty and circumstance. Some would acknowledge that they had believed in the ideology until the moment it immolated them. But nearly all would admit to one common experience, the moment when they understood that everything they had been told was a lie, that the promises of greatness were hollow, that their sacrifice served nothing except the prolongation of a dying regime's agony. The generals who had stood in the Führerbunker on April 22, who had listened to Hitler's demands for fanatical defense, who had clicked their heels and said it would be done, they carried particular burdens. Some, like Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, were executed as war criminals at Nuremberg. Others, like Weidling, died in Soviet captivity. A few survived to write memoirs that attempted to explain how professional soldiers could have enabled such catastrophe. Their explanations varied, but a common thread emerged: they had confused loyalty with complicity, duty with moral abdication, professional competence with ethical responsibility. They had believed that their role was to execute orders, not to question them. And by the time they understood their error, they were trapped in a bunker beneath a dying city, maintaining fictions until the end. The cans of food that Soviet soldiers found in Berlin's warehouses and Nazi facilities were eventually distributed to the city's starving population. In one of history's bitter ironies, the supplies that could have sustained Berlin's civilians during the siege were released only after the Nazi regime that had hoarded them collapsed. Soviet military authorities established feeding stations in occupied sectors, distributing the very provisions that German leadership had withheld. Berliners lined up for hours to receive rations from the army that had destroyed their city, a final, crushing demonstration of how thoroughly their leaders had failed them. Berlin's fall marked the end of World War II in Europe, but it marked something else as well, the definitive refutation of fascist ideology through the destruction of its heartland. The Nazi vision had promised that racial purity, militarism, and authoritarian leadership would create a new civilization surpassing all previous human achievement. Instead, it produced 12 years of increasingly savage war, systematic genocide, and ultimately the complete obliteration of the state that had embraced it. The ideology that claimed history was on its side was crushed by history. The movement that promised 1,000 years lasted 12. The leader who demanded absolute defense of the capital abandoned it through suicide rather than face the consequences of his commands. For those who study the fall of Berlin, the most haunting aspect is not the military defeat but the psychological dimension, the way intelligent, educated, professionally competent men maintained obvious fictions until the final hours. The generals who told Hitler that phantom divisions would relieve Berlin knew those divisions did not exist. The officers who planned counterattacks with non-existent forces knew the plans were meaningless. The soldiers who defended positions they knew could not be held understood their sacrifice was futile. Yet the machinery of compliance continued operating until it physically could not, until the Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag and silence finally descended on the ruins. This was not simply military defeat. It was the death of ideology through its collision with reality. And in that collision, in that moment when Hitler begged his generals to hold Berlin at all costs and they obeyed despite knowing it was impossible, we witness something profound about the human capacity for self-deception, about the deadly consequences of confusing loyalty with wisdom, about what happens when political movements disconnect from truth and demand that reality conform to belief rather than the reverse. The bunker where those final orders were given still exists beneath Berlin, sealed and unmarked, a tomb for delusions that cost millions of lives. The city that rose from the ruins became something its Nazi planners never imagined, a divided capital, then a reunited symbol of democracy, then a cosmopolitan metropolis where memorials to the Holocaust stand blocks from where Hitler commanded his final defense. Berlin survived the ideology that tried to make it the capital of a 1,000-year Reich. The Reich lasted 12 years. Berlin endures, rebuilt by hands that include descendants of those who destroyed it and those who defended it, a living monument to the simple truth that cities outlast the ideologies that try to possess them, that reality ultimately defeats delusion, and that the cost of following madness to its conclusion is measured in ruins, in graves, and in the bitter knowledge that it all could have been prevented if anyone had possessed the courage to say no when saying yes meant complicity in catastrophe. When the last shells fell silent and Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag on May 2, 1945, they had not simply captured a city. They had buried an ideology beneath the rubble of its own capital, demonstrating to the world that movements built on hatred, conquest, and the belief that willpower can overcome reality inevitably destroy themselves and everyone who follows them into the abyss.